Okay, I just pressed record. Hi, Steve.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. It's a treat and a pleasure and an honor to be talking to my favorite novelist in the world. I was in a bookstore in Toronto where you briefly lived, down on Queen Street, called Type Bookstore in 2013. I was about to go on my honeymoon, and I knew it had to be a good one. It's the honeymoon, had to be honeymoon worthy. The bookseller, who I remember her name still because she was so thoughtful about this project to find me a book for my honeymoon, Kalpna, she spent probably 2 hours with me picking 25 to 30 novels off the shelves thoughtfully. I read the first 5 pages of each, and the first 5 pages of A Fraction of the Whole were just like nothing I'd ever read. Torrid, blistering, uh, hilarious. So you accompanied me and my wife for 3 weeks through Southeast Asia, and this is still to this day my favorite novel. And thank you so much for the incredible 3 books that
No
you've
worries,
put
and
out.
you made it through the honeymoon
Yeah. Yeah,
together.
yeah.
Yes.
Imagine it was like, yeah, we read the book that was into the book so much that we didn't,
Yeah.
we just spent time together. The honeymoon went great. She told me on the flight home she was pregnant,
Oh wow.
and so now today, flash forward, we've got our son was born 9 months to the day after our wedding.
Okay, so
So
nine years old.
yeah, yeah, eight. He's eight
Yeah,
and a half.
I
Mm-hmm.
know. Cool.
So your sentences pulse, they crackle, there's something about the way you write sentence. I thought it might be fun to start before we get into your three most formative books, Steve, to just for me to just play back to you some of my favorite sentences and for you to offer a reflection on them. If these are something that you think, or maybe it's a character and you disagree with it, if you could expand, elucidate, just open these up for us if you don't mind.
Sure. I
Okay.
hope I remember. I hope I remember the sentences that you picked out.
And I'm not even going to tell you which of your books they're from because they're mixed up. Um, First quote: When you have poor intuition, everything is counterintuitive.
Yeah. Well, look, that makes sense to me because we part of like the I guess the hubris or arrogance is of that we have is we trust in yourself. Why should you
Mm.
trust in yourself?
Mm.
um it's like trust your intuition, your instincts, the instincts that kind of have led me astray in the past, the instincts that tell me, oh yeah, why don't you eat half this tub of ice cream standing at the fridge? Why should I trust me of all people?
Well, then how destabilizing is it though to not be able to trust yourself? I mean, don't we, if we can't trust our own thoughts, then what?
Yeah, it's a hit and miss. You just have to be, you have to sort of just be as, just keep a healthy skepticism, and I guess it's sort of about cognitive biases and,
Yeah.
just keeping your eye, know what your blind spots are. And, anyway, yeah.
That's I like that. I like that. It's about cognitive biases. How about this one? We are desperate to be diagnosed, but don't want to be classified.
Yeah, it's true. We want to be understood, but as soon as somebody labels us and puts a label on us, we kind of, I guess, struggle against it. Yeah, I think it's wanting to be seen. It's like someone who says, I feel seen. And I always think, well, you are seen, but maybe not in the way that you think you're seen. Um, like it's like when somebody tells you their dream and you realize, and you're like, do you realize you just, shown me something that I don't know if you've realized you've shown me? Um,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, yeah. I think it's that. I think it's the need to be seen, but also the feeling that if we are really seen, we won't like the category that puts us in.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I can so relate to this because, in my kind of nonfiction world, we're often told to put uh like self evaluation tests on our website, like the Myers-Briggs example.
Oh yeah,
Everybody
yeah.
wants to know what they are, ENTI, ENTJ. But as soon as you try to group people into like a category, as you say, we rail against that. I don't want to be known as shy, or I can be whatever I want. So
Exactly.
you put your thumb on it, right, with that one quick sentence. How about this one? This is a longer quote. No, the most insidious betrayals are done merely by leaving the life jacket hanging in your closet while you lie to yourself that it's probably not the drowning man's size.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I guess the point of that is that most of the kind of evil that we do, or the most of the negative things we put out into the world, is just indifference. Is just not, not helping people when we could. Um, it's yeah, and I think that's probably the worst thing we do every day. Is is not an act, not a negative act per se, but just the lack of a positive one.
Right, right. Okay, I can't resist. Here's a few more. Going to bed with a new woman is like having to learn a whole new operating system on the first day of work with the boss breathing down your neck.
Look, that one's just self-explanatory.
Thank you. Totally relate. How about this one? Because humans deny their own mortality to such an extent, they become meaning machines. I can never be sure when something supernatural or religious in nature occurs that I did not manufacture my connection to it out of desperation to believe in my own specialness.
Yeah, well, look, that's at the very heart of my first book. About the fear of death, and and the fact that we have this unconscious fear of death, and it's that fear that makes us kind of a danger to ourselves and other people, because it makes us act in sort of crazy ways. And yeah, and so in the book, yeah, but if you have an awareness of that, I think that's what happens when you learn something about yourself, and then you have an awareness of that knowledge, and it could sort of keeps doubling up on itself, and you never know where it ends and where it begins, and whether you can trust yourself or whether you can't, and whether, if you believe that that this fear of death sort of makes us into these meaning machines that create meaning, then when you do experience meaning, what does it mean?
Yeah.
Question.
I'm not going to go through them just for the sake of time, but I've got a whole other page of quotes that I've pulled out that I just love from your books. Greyhound thin, riddled with breasts. She moved like wind-blown leaves. The future is some kind of newfangled yesterday. And one of my favorites that I've written, these are just so people know, I've written out the quotes because I just love them so much. A failed entrepreneur is a loser, whereas a failed artist is an artist no matter what.
Yeah, that's
Maybe you're talking about me and you
true.
both. I mean, I love,
Yeah.
I hold that one close as I come up on a book launch. I'm like, well, you know what? I'm an artist either way.
Yeah.
We'll go with that. Steve, I have had a lot of fun spending time with you, your words, your books, and now your three most formative books, one of which I read when we met at the International Festival of Authors in Toronto 6 years ago because you told me to read it. I wondered, I have them in front of me here. Do you have an order that you preferred to talk about them? And I also have
Uh,
the, yeah.
what's
Is
the
there one that you
well?
read earlier in your life or?
Yeah, probably the first one. The first one I read was A Hero of Our Time.
Okay,
Is
great.
that one of the?
Well, if it's okay with you, yep. I just couldn't get a copy in
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
but
No
I've gone
worries.
through in detail online. But A Hero of Our Time, I'm going to let the listener feel like they're holding it in a bookstore, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us about your relationship with it. A Hero of Our Time by Mikhail Lermontov if I said that right, Lermontov, written and published in 1840 in Russian by Ilya Glasunov and Company. Of course, many English editions and translations over the year, including the most popular one, which is the Penguin Classics, the one from 1966. Cover a dark gray and black on the bottom band, dominated by a portrait of a young man with a somber expression, with a small, neat mustache, and what looks like full military garb. The author's name is in all caps in orange, and the title is in a neat cursive white across the bottom. Mikhail Lermontov was born in Moscow in 1814, died in 1841 in Caucasus, the Russian Empire. He's a Russian romantic writer, poet, and painter, sometimes called the poet of the Caucasus, up there with Pushkin. What's this book about? Well, basically, it recounts the adventures of this military officer, Pechorin, during his travels in the Caucasus. And now that I've said that word 3 times, am I saying it right, Caucasus?
Yeah. But I think the character, or in my mind, the character's name, and maybe, I mean, yeah, I'm wrong, but I think it's Pechorin, but maybe it's not.
Pechorin. No, I'm sure. I am sure I am wrong. Pechorin. So what happens is there's abductions, there's duels, there's sexual intrigues. A hero over time looks backwards to the tales of Sir Walter Scott and Lord Byron, so beloved by the Russian society in the 1820s and 30s. And the protagonist, Pechorin, is an archetypal Russian anti-hero. Worth pausing on that word because I know you indulge in anti-heroism a lot. This novel looks forward to the subsequent glories and passions of Russian literature that it helped make possible. Dewey Decimal Hits can file this under 891.733 for Russian fiction from the 1800s. Steve, please tell us about your relationship with a hero of our time by Mikhail Lermontov.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking because when you asked to pick 3 books and 3 books that were like had an impact on my writing life.
Formative.
Yeah, so this is a really important book for me because so when I finished university, I did a communications and arts communications degree at Newcastle in Australia, and I had a good time at university, but I felt when I'd finished, I didn't really connect with the theoretical or like, I made videos and I did some practical stuff at university. I majored in video production. I remember I didn't do a lot of the reading uh, for some
Is
reason.
this the like late 90s time frame?
Yeah, no, this is kind of early mid nineties.
Mid
Let's say
90s?
mid
Okay.
nineties. Um, Yeah, I remember I did a course where the very first philosophy they assigned was like about phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty and Derrida. And when you've never read any philosophy, like Aristotle or Plato or even Bertrand Russell, to suddenly go into like phenomenology, it just made no sense to me. Um, and I
I don't even know
remember
what phenomenology is.
don't worry about it. That's all I have to say. But I remember finishing uni and then thinking, I wish I'd done literature. I wish and so I went. I remember one day I went. I guess this was sort of pre-Google because it's an insane thing to do now. I went to the University of Sydney or the University of New South Wales. Can't remember which one, and I went to the Russian literature department and the head of the department, and I just kind of made an appointment with him and went in there and I said, look, I can't re-enroll in university, but I would love a reading list.
Mm.
Um, and I remember his attitude. I remember thinking, oh, he's probably going to be think this is great, like someone just interested in his field, but he seemed very confused as to why I was there. But he did give me a reading list of what he assigns the students who are studying Russian literature, and the first book on the list was Pushkin, and I remember looking at that and thinking, well, that's a poem. I'm not ready for that. And the second book on the list was A Hero of Our Time by Lermontov, and um, that book I think is responsible for for the structure of my novels. Certainly for A Fraction of the Whole and Quicksand, because it tells the way that it's about it's about one person. It's a character study, and um, in my novels, they really are about a character, about a person, and it really opened up for me the way that you can, um, explore a character in a kind of non-traditional, non-linear fashion. So in Hero of Our Time, we have this nameless narrator who meets a man on the train, and this man's name is Maxim Maxovich, and they're just kind of bored on the train, and so Maxim tells a story about this guy that he used to know, Pechorin, and he tells this little. First of all, he starts telling him about the type of person he was, and then he tells him this long story about the time Pechorin kidnapped a woman and made her fall in love with him. And then it's kind of like a short story, like a little novella about Pechorin and this woman Bella. And then they arrive at their destination on the train, and the character Maxim actually meets Pechorin, who he hasn't seen in many years, and the narrator is witnessing this. And Maxim is so excited because they were very close, and Pechorin just treats him rudely, and it's a very upsetting scene. Um, and Pechorin gives him his diaries, and then sort of wanders off as if to die. And then the next chapter is Pechorin's diaries, and then we have another
Oh.
insight into, and it's this whole other long story. Called Princess Mary, and that is also is kind of like a novella, where we're right inside Pechorin's head, and he's this kind of, he is an anti-hero. He's sort of bored and listless, and he goes to this kind of spa, and he ends up dueling and manipulating, and he's just a really interesting character. Um, and I can't quite remember. There's two other stories in the book where you see them from other points of view, where you see Pechorin from other points of view, and in other situations. Um, and so the whole book is a portrait of this guy, but you've seen him from like five different angles, from the inside, from the outside. Um, in relation to another character, which is a great way to basically explore a character. Um, you see him as sort of as a friend and as a husband, and as a lover, and you see him at different stages of his life, and it's a pretty slim novel. Not that I certainly never learned that. The skill of writing slim novels, but yeah, and so as you probably know, so my novels, I do the same with my books, in that there's sort of diary entries, or or in A Fraction of the Whole, there's also sort of a failed, an incomplete autobiography. Um, there's views from the other character. In Quicksand, I use court transcripts, and yeah, all those police interviews. I like using. I learned from that book that there are many ways into a story, um, and I think it's not only just that there are not other ways. I like having each of those ways be um, complete in their own way.
Mm.
So, I mean, writing A Fraction of the Whole and Quicksand, I really was writing a series of short stories and novellas that are linked, that but are so enmeshed. It is a novel,
Mm-hmm.
but I do try to make each chapter and each section its own thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have lots of questions here. First of all, what compelled you to do this in the first place? The pursuing of a reading list of the Russians. Well, how did you navigate to even that point? Because
Woody
you
Allen.
you have an eclectic taste in literature.
Yeah.
How did you come to
I
that?
would blame Woody Allen for that because, um, I mean, another formative book for me were Woody Allen's collections of prose pieces that he wrote for the New Yorker. There's a book.
Ah,
The first
without
one's
feathers or
called
side
Without,
effects?
yeah, Without Feathers and Side Effects. And so I read those. I came across those, I think, while I was still at university. So when I was about 19. Um, and you read them because they're funny, but they are, it's sort of, it takes a little while, but you realize, um, that they are all parodies in some way of 19th century Russian and French literature, and sort of mid-century kind of, or early to mid 20th century surrealism and existentialism. Um, and so, there's sort of the letters that Van Gogh wrote to his brother Theo, but transposed as if they were dentists. There are, there's kind of versions of Sartre, there's versions like of Nausea, but there's a lot of reference to Russian literature, which I read that probably in conjunction with watching Love and Death, film, um, which is all basically a parody of 19th century Russian literature.
Right.
Um, and so I was kind of just drawn to understand what he was referencing. I knew that he was referencing Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. I certainly had never, um, and then, I mean, the third book on that list, before you get to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, after Lermontov, was Gogol. And
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you've ever read Nikolai Gogol, but like, it reads like Woody Allen.
The
It's,
Nose, right?
yeah, the nose and,
I think I read The Nose in the George Saunders book, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain.
okay. Well, there was this other story. I'm not going to get the names right, but it was, how someone quarreled with another Ivan. How these two Ivans quarreled, and it was such absurd humor. I'd never realized that, because I always thought classic literature has a serious. I just thought
Yeah,
it must be
serious.
serious,
Mm-hmm.
but it's so silly and so funny. Yeah, and so basically it was,
The Nose, it should be said, is about like literally a guy opening up a sandwich or slicing a loaf of bread, and there's an actual nose in there. And he tries to
and
get rid
then,
of it, and then the police arrest him for littering, and just goes on from there. It's a bizarre
yeah,
dream kind of thing.
and the
Yeah.
nose is walking around, right?
Yeah.
I can't, I can't. Yeah, it's very strange. So yeah, no. So basically, I think, my kind of interest in Woody Allen and his prose basically put me onto it.
So you mentioned that you have written your books, wonderful books. Can't recommend them enough. So big part of this conversation is I want people to go out and read Here Goes Nothing and Quicksand and A Fraction of the Whole. Like, I like want more people to read your stuff. Like, I know you've been nominated for the Man Booker and all, but it just seems to me that when I say, "Do you know the Steve Toltz book?" Most people, just in general, the numbers of people in the world, they don't, right? They don't know
Yeah,
anybody on average. So, but this is me saying, please read your stuff. So you say, okay, little, you write these little novellas and you write things from different perspectives. But I'd love to just dive a little deeper into process, if you don't mind, Steve.
sure.
How do you write your books? How do you write them? How do you write your books?
Well, I still write by hand. Um, so yeah, I basically fill notebooks. Um, these kind of notebooks.
Okay, he's holding up a
Um,
notebook for people that are on audio that looks like about 100 page of blank paper.
yeah, I mean
Okay.
lined paper, but
Uh
and
huh.
then I type it up, and when I finish typing it up, I like put a line through it so I know that I've typed it up. Because yeah, it's quite funny that you can, the my I write in such a way that when the worst has happened, like I left one of the notebooks on a plane once, like a full notebook, which would have been, a couple of months work of writing. There's no getting it back. Can't, just like I have no idea what I've written after I've written it, until that
Interesting.
process of it being typed up. I mean, now I save some time because it used to be very laborious to type up the notes. But now there's like dictation software is good enough, voice recognition software that I can just read it out. So that makes the process a bit faster.
So what happens before the notebook though? You don't just start writing and you're on page one of the book, do you? Or do you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, what do you mean? Sorry.
So are you doing cue cards to map a plot across a wall? Are you
Oh no, nothing like that. No, no, I am just yeah. I kind of just do it in my mind. Like I have like sometimes I will I'll write a little point by point beat sheet kind of thing of what I want, of what I think will happen. But I do just generally have an idea and start writing and
do you know where the story is going, or do you find out as you write?
I often know where the story is going. I never know how I'm going to get there. So it's sort of like having an end point. Like I have a beginning point and an end point, but I have no idea what the journey is. And so that is the process. Um, yeah,
It's
and I
interesting too.
and
Yeah.
no, no. So I was just gonna say, and what I will often write the beginning, and the beginning will sometimes end up being the middle. So yeah, the beginnings. I used to say when I was writing Quicksand, I think I spent 3 years on page one, and all of those page ones are in the book at different places. So
Ah.
so there were like I didn't know whether yeah. So I it wasn't a waste of time writing all those page ones because they're all in there somewhere. There's probably about 50 page ones in that book at different
The
locations.
and the page one you ended up with. Here's the first sentence of Quicksand for people. Down at the foamy shoreline, where small, tight waves explode against black rocks, a lifeguard with feet wedged in the wet and vaguely tangerine sand stands shirtless like a magnificent sea Jesus. So I'm in awe of your writing process and what comes out of it. Now, why are you clinging to handwritten here? There's gotta be a reason for that.
Yeah, there's an important reason. Well, one, it's habit because when I started writing this book, I was living in Barcelona and I don't think I had a laptop. I think I just didn't have a computer at that stage. So that was probably, or I might have, but um, it certainly wasn't one that I could like carry around. And my other part of my process, which sounds insane, is that I write in 2 hour blocks, but I
Mm-hmm.
need I need those blocks to be in different locations.
Mm.
So I, will write maybe 2 hours at a cafe, then 2 hours in a library, but 2 hours, on a bench or at a beach, or when I lived in Paris, I used to write in this cemetery, in the cemetery of Montmartre. Um, yeah, I just like to move around, and um, so certainly in those years, like moving around with a notebook was just easier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
Yeah.
then not only that, um, I yeah, for me, writing and thinking on the page, it's like I have like a visceral connection to the written word, the handwritten word, um, and that's sort of the way it comes out. Like I can't, um, like I'm surprised by the sentences I'm writing. It's like there's an unconscious part of my mind that is doing the writing. I'm directing it, but um, I'm also my first reader because I'm like a split millisecond behind. And so, yeah, it's sort of it's like my hand is my hand is creating and I'm kind of watching.
George Saunders talks about that too. We had him as our guest in chapter 75 of this show. He did pick a Russian as well, a
Oh
Chekhov.
yeah. Okay.
Um, and he talks about, releasing yourself to the subconscious as you write. And for someone like me who is not as good at that, what do you do to prime yourself or to get yourself into that mental or subconscious state? What are the ingredients or habits that allow for that to happen?
um well, I think it's just, I mean, luckily, it is, I do have just kind of, I think handwriting does, yeah, I think writing by hand does help that process because, um, or it does for me because there is something about it feels like it's a very physical act, the act of writing. But for me, I only need to write, to read, like a lot of writers don't read while they write because they don't want to be influenced. But I actually welcome the influence. I feel that like I'm in sort of a feedback loop with writers, and I can't I can't really write without having read because
Mm-hmm.
I like to get excited by the art form. Um, and the downside of that is I can't read without wanting to write. So in periods where I have other jobs and I just cannot find the time to write, I I can't read anymore in those periods because if I read one, all it takes is reading one beautifully crafted sentence for me to like have a very strong desire to pick up a pen and write.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, so so that's basically what inspires me. It takes literally 1 second. I just have to pick up any book that I love, read one sentence, and I'm fired up to write. Um, and then yeah, I guess getting into trying to get into a flow state that definitely kind of loosens up the subconscious
How do you do
into.
that?
I just start to write the thing that I'm trying to write, and then not, I certainly don't worry if what I'm writing is absolute crap. Which, like, yeah, which definitely I don't. Um, I would say 10% of what I write ends up in the book. That's probably, I don't know. I mean, and I cut a lot out. Um, so, I always have a file on my computer on my desktop called Junkyard, and so which I will, put all the chopped up bits that didn't make it in the book. And by the end of each book, those documents are sort of 600 pages long.
Lots more questions about writing and process, and we're going to dive into some of them through another one of your formative books. Do you have a preference if we go to Celine or John Fante next?
Not really. Let's go John Fonte.
Okay, John Fante. This is the book that I read when you told me to read it 6 years ago, and I think very, very fondly of this. So let me introduce it to our viewers and our listeners now. This book is Ask the Dust by John Fante, Fante, published in 1939 by Stackpole Sons. I've got a cover that almost looks like a sepia tinged portrait of like an old Hollywood. There's like a white cinder building with a big palm tree in front of it. Ask the Dust in black kind of impact font against a yellow ribbon. John Fante in a white impact font against a dark yellow ribbon. Underneath it says, with an introduction by Charles Bukowski, and it also has in a red burst, now a major motion picture. There is one blurb at the top of the cover. It says, either the work of John Fante is unknown to you, or it is unforgettable. He was not the kind of writer to leave room in between. At the back, At the top, it says Fante Was My God by Charles Bukowski. Ask the Dust is a virtuoso performance by an influential master of the 20th century American novel. It is the story of Arturo Bandini, a young writer in 1930s LA who falls hard for the elusive, mocking, unstable Camila Lopez, a Mexican waitress. Struggling to survive, he perseveres until at last his first novel is published, but the bright light of success is extinguished when Camila has a nervous breakdown and disappears. ... And Bandini forever rejects the writer's life he fought so hard to maintain. John Fante began writing in 1929, published his first short story in 1932. He died May 8th, 1983, at the age of 74. File this one under 813.52 for 20th century North American fiction. Steve, please tell us about your relationship with Ask the Dust by John Fante.
Yeah, this book is one of my favorite books, and it's had a really big influence on me because I don't know when I read it. I think I was like early 20s when I read this book, maybe 23, 24. And it seems to me that until I read this novel, I had never known that you could put poetry in prose. Like I'd never read sentences like this. Like there's like a little moment early on in the book where he describes Los Angeles as a sad flower in the sand. And then there's another, there are just a few sentences which really like jolted me as just in a story. And there's another bit where there's a woman and, he says that like her mouth looks like it was dug out with raw fingernails and her old child's eyes swim in blood written like mad sonnets. And this is pre-Beats, and I hadn't, and I mean, I had read the Beats, so I guess I had experienced that, but maybe I'd read them too young.
When you say the Beats, you mean Charles
I mean,
Bukowski and
I mean Kerouac. I hadn't
Kerouac,
read.
Jack
Yeah,
Kerouac, On the Road and stuff like that. Yeah,
exactly like that. Which do have some of that in Ginsberg, but like
those were 40s, 50s, and this was 1930s, right?
yeah, exactly. And so so the poetry of it certainly struck me, but also I think the voice of the character was one. Like other than maybe Catcher in the Rye, which again I read very young. This book was the first book that just had a voice that just I felt so captured by. That it really influenced. I mean, we'll talk about Celine, but I feel like the voice definitely influenced Jasper Dean in the book. He's also John Fonte also wrote John Fonte also wrote books, a number of other novels and short stories of when he was about when he was a child. And also the other reason he was very influential is that when I read an author that I love, I want to know what they loved. I want to know how they became the writer that they were. And Fonte sent me both forward and back in time. So he sent me forward to Bukowski, who, as you said, wrote the version I read was a Black Sparrow Press book version, which is who Bukowski was published by, and they don't make them anymore. It still exists in a form, but the way that the originals were printed was just I don't know how to describe it, but it is a very beautiful object. And Bukowski did the forward for the book. And so I'd never heard of Bukowski when I had read John Fonte. So that sent me forward to Bukowski, but it also sent me back to someone who became who is probably, in my top three authors, the Norwegian uh, author Knut Hamsun.
Hmm.
Um,
Is this the author of
so
Pornographia?
no,
Okay, sorry.
no, that's right. That's Gombrowicz. He's a Polish writer. Knut Hamsun. He's from Norway. He he, especially his first three books, um, Hunger, Pan, and Mysteries. In fact, there is a line. There's a line in Pan which has the phrase "Ask the Dust" in it,
Hmm.
and that's where Fonte got the title of
Hmm.
his book. He was so influenced, um, and again, it's this. I mean, Hampson was I guess a contemporary of Dostoevsky, so they were writing more or less at the same time, um, and um, Hampson um, has a way of writing that is very much about the war, the kind of the warring selves in a mind, but it's also kind of pantheistic in terms of his kind of love of nature, um, and yeah, he's just one of my favorite writers. I love him so much, and so yeah, so I got that from Fonte, um, and Mysteries was one of Henry Miller's favorite novels. So it becomes like a bit of a family tree,
Yeah.
um, and Henry Miller, goes connects to Celine, and sort of so um, yeah, that's how all these writers relate to each other. So that was another Fonte kind of gift to me, was Knut Hamsun. I mean, Hamsun ultimately, like Celine, fell out of had a fall from grace because he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, um, and then he gave that Nobel Prize to Hermann Goering as a birthday gift, because he was sympathetic to the Nazis, and so he became a disgrace in his own country. And that the Norwegians sort of didn't know what to do with him because he is their greatest writer. Um, but yeah, he was
He
an
got
old
canceled.
man. He
He
got
got canceled early.
he got cancelled, and they sort of, I think they ended up putting him in an insane asylum for a little while, and lately they've rehabilitated him. But yeah, I would recommend those three books very much. Yeah, Hunger, Mysteries, and Pan.
And the first phrase I think you mentioned with Ask the Dust was voice, right? It was the voice. It was
Yeah,
the voice. How do you define voice? How does an author develop or discover their voice?
yeah, that's a really hard one. Actually, I feel. I mean, it's sort of, I define it by the way that the character sort of thinks, articulates themselves on the page, and um, I would define it, I guess, also practically by, if you put this character in a scene, how that character responds, uniquely, as opposed to how any other character would respond. You should be able to pick up your character and put them anywhere, uh, in any situation, and be able to write that from their unique and particular point of view. Um, and it's also like, how they would philosophically interact with the world, how they would react, what they would think of whatever is happening. Um, yeah, I mean, how a writer develops voice, I have no idea. Like I couldn't give any advice as to that, because um, it's usually voice is usually an alter ego. of a character. Like, Arturo Bandini, the character, is John Fonte's alter ego, and there's a quartet of books featuring Bandini. Wait Until Spring Bandini, which was the first one. Ask the Dust is the second. Actually, there was another one called The Road to Los Angeles, which I think had been written first but published third. And then later in his life, he had some bad luck. John Fonte, he had diabetes and went blind. That's also, but also he had bad luck with his book because his book had poor sales, and I don't know if this is true, but it was sort of published in Germany, and his publisher was sued by Hitler, at the time, and there was something to do with Hitler and Mein Kampf, and like there was a whole controversy that set Fonte's publisher out of business. That might be an apocryphal story, which I can't quite remember.
No, it's okay. And Bandini wanted to be a writer, right? In the book, his debut novel comes out. You wanted to be a writer. You did it through many jobs in many cities. I think I have a note here from, your Wikipedia profile, which of course is, you got to always take it with a grain of salt. But I had it written down where is it here? Prior to his literary career, Steve Toltz lived in Montreal, Vancouver, New York City, Barcelona, and Paris, variously working as a cameraman, telemarketer, security guard, private investigator, English teacher, and screenwriter. So, I'm assuming, is that right? Am I getting that correct? First of all,
yeah, that's all. Okay. That's all true.
So, and then your debut novel comes out, A Fraction of the Whole. It's shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. You can't think of a bigger prize, really. I guess the Pulitzer you mentioned. Wall Street Journal says this is a riotously funny first novel by Australian Steve Toltz that's harder to ignore than A Crate of Puppies, twice as playful and just about as messy. So my question is, in this story, the main guy publishes a debut novel. So did you. You did so in your early 30s, if I have it right. And I think you're famous for saying you took no other writing input leading up to that. You didn't commit. You didn't have a writer friends. You didn't hang out in a writer pub. You didn't have writing classes, right? So, and then this thing comes out and it's a huge hit. You didn't get sued by Hitler, but you got pretty public here. So talk to me about how you keep your head kind of before and after. And when I say before, I mean sounds like at least a decade where you're alone with this document that you don't know if it's anything, and then after where you're kind of buried under heaps of praise.
Yeah, I mean, the before part, I remember I'd been writing for about a year before I was like, I felt confident in what I had. It's true. It's a weird thing to write such a big book without showing anyone a single page. And it's true that I just never met a writer. I didn't do, in Australia, we don't really have MFAs, which is a big part of the kind of North American writing kind of landscape. We might now, but not when I was coming up. So I'd never met a writer. So I'd never, got into that bit. I never workshopped anything or didn't write short stories, or I just wasn't in any literary.
Your peers were security guards, private investigators, telemarketers.
Exactly. There you go. And living in different countries. So, and so, but when the book comes out, you sort of, it doesn't affect, that's always a question. I feel like that's a little bit in the minds of other people more than it is in reality. And perhaps it is a component of having lived so long, to get to 30 without having succeeded in anything means you kind of, I'd also spent my 20s making short films and writing screenplays that went nowhere. So I was kind of like used to failure. And so if you want to become a novelist, you just sort of have to like be a loser for a while, and so I was kind of quite used to that position in life. uh, so, but
What do you
having
mean by that? I have to be a loser for a while.
well,
You mean because you have to just deal with the constant daily rejection of it, nothing you're making succeeding in any way for so long? Is that what you're talking about?
yeah, and nothing. I didn't have a backup career, so I was doing all those things. Like I was like, I mean, telemarketing is a job that you do when you have no skills. And like you turn up in a city and you can answer an ad and become a telemarketer. You're answering phones, or you're calling up, cold calling people out of the phone book in like dingy offices. um, I was also, I don't know if it's there in that list that you read, I can't remember, but I was also a TV extra for a long time, which is
It's
a
not in
job.
the list.
Well, that's a job where all you need, your only qualifications are like a human face.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
Or you
literally,
in a body.
yeah, that's all you need. And they're affectionately known as warm props in the TV film business. So so doing those kind of jobs, and then writing a novel which takes years and no one's ever seen, and what are you doing? I'm just kind of writing something. And I don't know, I guess having lived for a decade, having to sustain myself with my own self-belief in my writing, in my ability. And of course you have to be wrong for a while before you're right, because
Well, yeah.
you have your it takes a while for talent to catch up with ambition,
Mm.
because of the, I guess that that 10,000 hours thing is more or less right. um so you
But that
have to
belief
sort
in
of,
but that belief in yourself that you just mentioned, for 10 years you're working odd jobs in odd cities, you're telemarketers, you're a warm prop, and yet somehow there's some fire inside you that said, I'm on to something here. Like you, because talking a little bit on behalf of the number of emails and letters I get from people saying, the issue is that they quit and you didn't
right.
quit. So
Well,
what was the
that is
muscle
the
that
issue.
what prevented you from not quitting so long?
Oh, that's easy. Fear of the alternative. So quitting would mean, what would that have meant for me? It would have meant taking another career and doing another job full time that I wasn't suited to, didn't like, didn't want to do. Um, and so this was something I knew I enjoyed and wanted to make my life doing, and I just had to make it work. And when I look back to the my early writings, they weren't they weren't good. There's no way they were good. At least first 10 years of writing wasn't anything good there. I mean, there are bits that ended up sort of persisting, and I definitely, the odd sentence here or there, or um, but yeah. So not quitting is key, because if I had, you know, if I had looked at the writing that I had when I was sort of 25, 26, 27, and gone, this isn't good enough, I'm not good enough, then that would have, that's where it would have ended. But I had to push through until I became good enough, until the writing got better.
Well, it's
And
interesting,
that's
this fear of the alternative.
yeah. And
What
that, I
about
mean,
now?
that's
You're a successful writer. Now what's the alternative?
well, I mean, you still have to, yeah, I mean, successful writer, but I still have to work, I do other things, because if I was a faster writer, putting out one, I was thinking, yeah, when I was 16, I worked at McDonald's. That's not in there. McDonald's, and I was making, $4 an hour, I think, at the time. And I remember being, I remember even at 16 thinking $4 an hour, that's shit. But I knew I'm 16 years old. I'm at the beginning of my work life. It's all going to be uphill from here. But then, I became a novelist, and if you being a novelist, the hourly wage of a novelist puts a sweatshop to shame, really, because you have to over 7 years.
The hourly wage of a novelist put the sweatshop to shame.
Yeah. So you continue, and I guess what I yeah, to get back to your original question, the idea about what does it mean for the writer to have praise? Nothing. I mean, it's again, like, better than the alternative is something that I feel like you can answer most questions, or the other answer is compared to what. It's sort of like you get praise compared to not having praise, or your book did really well. That must be stressful compared to it not doing well. That would be stressful too. So it doesn't affect what you write next. It doesn't affect you in any way other than that's nice.
Well, that's amazing. I am massively affected by praise and criticism. Hugely. I'm in awe of the sense of self that you have that just tethers your own self-worth to what you think as opposed to what others think. That's not a place that I think a lot of people get to very easily, and maybe you just were like that, but I'm jealous of that.
Yeah, maybe I was. I mean, there's yes, like it's getting praise or getting criticism. Yeah, they do sort of bounce off me. Yes, the advantage is the criticism doesn't, unless there's something I agree with, you know. There is a line in my new book, Here Goes Nothing, which says, the character says, I never minded insults because they're like, they're amusing if they aren't true, and they're a free life lesson if they are.
Yes, I underlined that quote. That's a
Yeah,
great
and
line.
I do
Amusing if they
feel,
aren't true, and a free life lesson if they are.
yeah, and I feel that way about criticism. Like, nothing really bothers me about it, other than sometimes you read a bad review and you go, well, the practical repercussions is like, oh well, that's going to dissuade a few people from reading my book. I mean, that bums me out, that, but it doesn't, if I agree with some of the notes, I'm like, I'm also, that's fair. I feel like whatever I am, whatever my, whatever heights I reach, I feel like I'm a bit of a mess. So it's sort of, everything's a little bit flawed, and I'm okay with that.
I feel like I'm a bit of a mess. What do you mean?
Well, I just mean, I feel like, um, yeah, my books are, there's a flaw in everything, and I'm okay with that. They're just sort of like, they're not little jewels of perfection.
Yeah,
They're, like
and they
writing
don't
a,
pretend to be.
yeah, I mean that, but that's what happens. I mean, I wish I had it off my hands. Bolaño has a good, I don't know if you like the Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño,
No, don't know.
who,
Oh,
uh,
I think I have the Savage Detectives right behind me.
yeah, that's my favorite of his. I guess that's the
Uh,
first one that I read.
uh,
That was a really huge book for me.
he
Yeah,
has a
he has.
quote.
Yeah, here's a quote about, I'm not going to remember it, but it's about these kind of, these big novels that when you go after the big novel, it's always going to be a mess.
Mm.
There's no way that it's not.
Speaking of big novels that may or may not be a big mess, let's transition now to Journey to the End of the Night by Celine. Published originally in French as Voyage au bout de la nuit, First published, like a lot of your favorite books are, Steve, in 1932 in France, translated to English in 1952 by New Directions. There's lots of different covers. My cover is like this black cover with a cream colored, scribbly pencil crown drawing. It says Celine across the top, journal to the end of the night down the left side, and it's like a almost like a scribbly skeleton with a horse's head and like an oil painting on the top. Louis Fernand Celine was a French novelist, polemicist, if I said that right, which is, I
Mm-hmm.
think I looked it up, like a professional arguer, and a physician who lived from 1894 to 1961. What is this book about? Ferdinand Celine's revulsion and anger at what he considered the idiocy and hypocrisy of society explodes from nearly every page of this novel, filled with slang, obscenities, and written in a raw, colloquial language. Journey to the End of the Night is a literary symphony of violence, cruelty, and obscene nihilism. The book shocked critics when it was first published in France, but quickly became a success with the reading public in Europe and later in America. This is a story of an improbable yet convincingly described travels of the petit bourgeois and largely autobiographical anti-hero, there it is again, Bardamu, from the trenches of World War I to the African jungle to New York to a Ford assembly line in Detroit, and finally to a failed doctor in Paris. This book takes readers by the scruff and hurtles them toward the novel's inevitable sad conclusion. File this one under 843.91 for 20th century French literature. Steve, please tell us about your relationship with the big, messy novel Journey to the End of the Night by Celine.
Yeah, this is one of those books. In fact, a lot of books for me, because I didn't study literature and writing, and I was sort of just finding my own way. Um, it's crazy to me now how many sort of great and famous novels I discovered by just picking them off the bookshelf in a bookstore. Going, I've never heard of this. I like the cover, um, and this was one of those ones where I'm like, oh, what's this? I never heard of him, and it really. This is the book. If I pick one book that I wish I'd have written, this would be this book. Um, it is, yeah, like it is one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. Again, it's a voice-driven novel. Without this book, it's hard to imagine Henry Miller or Bukowski or Kurt Vonnegut. He's yeah, I remember reading it, and early on, I think that again the poetry of it's sort of struck me. Um, it is a picaresque novel, meaning that you just sort of, um, which my novels can be accused of, is sort of like it's one thing after another. Like
Would
the
you say
character.
picaresque?
Yeah, picaresque is just a
Not
term.
picturesque.
No, not picturesque. Picaresque.
Huh.
Um,
How do you spell that?
it's Picaresque. I think picaresque.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a
picaresque.
it's a term that describes, like a literary term that describes the type of novels. There were some 19th century novels like that where it's just a character wandering, and it's sort of like it's a succession of incidents. So
Mm-hmm.
in this book, the character begins where he's sitting in a French cafe in Paris, arguing with his friend about how disgusting the French are, and how and then uh, um, and a I guess some soldiers walk by, and on a whim, the main character just likes, well, I'm going to join them, and then he follows them, and then he just sort of walks with them into the barracks, and then they close the doors behind him, and then suddenly he's in World War One, and then he's fighting in the French countryside, fighting the Germans, um, and then he sort of comes back to Paris, gets on a boat to Africa, has a stint in Africa, then goes to New York, has a stint in New York, goes back to Paris, like it, and then he has his time in Detroit at the Ford production line, goes back to Paris to become a doctor, and so it just follows the adventures of his adventures, and it's yeah, his voice especially, like it, talk about influence, and certainly in my novel A Fraction of the Whole, it's hard to imagine who Martin Dean would have become had I not read this book.
Yeah.
um
That was one of the
because
best characters I've ever read, Martin Dean.
thank
It's
you.
incredible character.
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly this. I guess there's three parts to Martin Dean. There's the philosopher character. There's um, there's the kind of the me element of him, and then there's the kind of, I guess, the cynic character, the character that sees through the hypocrisy of everything around him, and that definitely is something that I was influenced from Celine. Just the I guess the muscular prose, the kind of explosive. A lot of people find this book really depressing and nihilistic, but I find it funny and very humanistic. Um, I think his disgust at kind of human nature, um, which people find really dark and pessimistic and awful and nihilistic. I see it as kind of this kind of desperation for of kind of wanting there to be more beauty, and seeing it when it is, appreciating when it is, and he has this kind of love. Yeah, it's kind of a love hate relationship with with human nature, and he's a doctor, so he goes around helping people. um, and there's another character in the book called Robinson, who he kind of meets at odd times through the story.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's just a book that I lived with, and I would, yeah, I carried it with me. When I couldn't carry the whole book because I had so many books, I just tore it and had a section of it.
Oh, it's funny.
Um,
I've done that too. I
yeah,
remember I was finishing Freedom or the Corrections, and I was going to on a Caribbean trip, and I just like cut the last 100 pages because I couldn't fit it in my suitcase.
yeah, I do
Yeah,
that sometimes. It's
yeah.
fine. It's just I guess it's like acerbic, poetic. Um, and I guess it's the first time that I believed this character existed so much.
Mm.
That it feels very raw and real, and yet it has crazy flights of imagination. Um, that and it's this, and his descriptions are just incredibly honest. He's incredibly honest, psychologically acute, poetic, real, and yeah, they're just he's just a writer that I tremendously admire. And again, a writer, if you're one of those people who can't separate the artist and the art, he also got taken down for being I'm Jewish, and so it doesn't faze me, but he was taken down for being a virulent anti-Semite. He did write separately these kind of pamphlets which were very anti-Jewish. Um, but luckily, he manages to keep his anti-Semitism, whatever it was, out of his art. So it's not evident in his books. He doesn't infuse the books with them, which is lucky. Um, but I mean, like there's very excitingly, there was so what happened to him was he was arrested, and everything was taken and sued, and everything was taken away from him, including a manuscript that was only recently uncovered, and it was so a new book is about to come out from him from the period of him in his prime. So I think even after his second book was called Death on the Installment
Yeah, so
Plan.
he lived 1894 to 1961.
Right. So there's a book from the 30s that is about to be translated, and it's very controversial in France because they do have, again, like Hampson, like a mixed relationship. It's like, what do you do with this guy who is one of France's probably the 20th century's greatest writer from France, but horrible anti-Semite. It doesn't phase me in the least because I sincerely believe in the rarity of this kind of thing. People who are influenced seem to believe that artists are interchangeable. It's like, well, you take this one out, we can just celebrate another artist who isn't an anti-Semite. I'm like, there aren't that many, there aren't that many masterpieces, and we can't afford to lose them. So we just have to sit with the fact that he might have been an unpleasant person.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm into birding. I've gotten into birding during the pandemic, as a lot of people have. And as you get into birding, these names and figures kind of come up, Audubon, and then as you get into them, you start looking them up. A lot of them sound like terrible people, and
Yeah,
and you're hit with this feeling of, do I follow the person's work, these beautiful paintings of birds that were so formative to the development of ornithology, or do I find out the person? I've always just erred on the side of, yeah, like you follow the art, not the person behind the art, and oftentimes you
yeah,
can't see it, and oftentimes the glimpse you can see is through some kind of crazy funhouse mirror. I know that the version of me that people might perceive from whatever on the internet isn't me. So I'm
yeah,
always
yeah,
just trying to give people the benefit of the doubt on whatever it is, that they have. Plus, I do think this might be controversial, but I think everyone's got wild and crazy thoughts. Not to forgive somebody for atrocious beliefs or whatever, but you're looking back 100 years ago and saying,
exactly. Yeah,
you know, uh, you
yeah. You
know,
can't. It's this sort of sickness of presentism as well, where people are judged by the standards of 20. The standards of 2022 aren't even the same standards of 2017.
well, that's the thing.
So let alone 1917.
I used words on this show, this podcast that started in 2018 that I listen to now, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that, or I presumed a certain pronoun, or whatever it was,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like but you can't. Yeah, presentism is a wonderful, wonderful word. Um, so quickly, all three of your books are between 90 and 180 years old. And I think I've heard you at the Australian Writers Festival say you consciously don't read anything current. I don't know if that's true. You don't read anything
I
new?
don't read much current. It's not that I don't read anything current. But I don't read that. Yeah. I basically, if you want, um, yeah, because yeah, I'm aware of how many books a person can read within their lifetime. And it's a shockingly limited number compared to the number of books that are out there. And so there's no reason, if you want, you can just leap from masterpiece to masterpiece, because there's books have been so it just happens that those books have been around for longer, to more guarantee you, like, if 10 books come out, out of all the books that come out this year, how many are likely to be masterpieces? Not many.
No.
um, and so, but also, I mean, I don't necessarily go back to the 19th century. I mean, I'm not done with the 1970s yet,
Mm-hmm.
or the 19,
Mm.
so books from the 1970s which still stand up. I definitely don't just read classics, but I definitely don't. I don't experiment with too much with what comes out, like, this week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's one of the goals we have of this show is to by talking to people who are alive and asking them what is most formative to them, hoping to find books that kind of have stood the test of time and gone through history. David Mitchell in chapter 58 of the show said, if there's a book in print today that's over 100 years old, it's for a very good reason,
Yeah,
you
I
know.
totally agree with that.
Now you are living with your 10-year-old son. How do you raise a reader today?
Um, well, I'm also sort of try to. Uh, I guess the most important thing is that you make your child see reading as a pleasure. That has to be the pleasure principle, has to be the number one. They have to love reading. And so it really doesn't matter. Like, I'm not trying to force classics on him because, I mean, I have done a little bit, but, but a classic in children's literature is, Roald
Mm-hmm.
Dahl,
Yeah.
or C.S. Lewis or something like that. But I try to find books which I think he will love. And I do kind of curate. I always have books in the cupboard for him that I'm like, I can't wait. I'm sort of waiting for him to like get old enough to read Hitchhiker's Guide, which I think is about a year's time, which was a really big book for me. But yeah, so
Well, we don't often have Man Booker shortlisted novelists on the program who have 10-year-old sons, and I've got little boys that are a little bit younger than yours. Can you give us a little handful of the Steve Toltz curated children's literature special?
sure. Well, my son really loves funny books, so he really loved, these are books that you might know. They're in like North America because I didn't hear them. I hadn't heard of them. The guy who wrote the book Holes, which he really
Mm.
loved.
Lewis Sacker, who's been on our show.
Okay, so his
Yeah.
Sideways stories, like, yeah, he really loved those books.
Sideways Stories from Wayside School and the three sequels.
Yeah,
Yeah, those are wonderful.
yeah. When
Um,
he was younger, he liked this guy named Stephen Pastis, wrote these books. Timmy Failure, he likes those.
Timmy Failure. Okay, don't know those.
Yeah, they're but they might be a bit younger, like for 7-year-olds.
But there's no such thing as too young, too old.
That's true.
No book shame, no book guilt. I mean, these are books I'm gonna pick up.
Yeah,
I mean, I still love the Sideways Stories from Wayside School today at age 43. I mean, it's still one
yeah,
of my
they're
favorites.
fantastic.
Keep going. I'd love
Yeah,
keep mentioning some of
I
them.
just got him a Holocaust novel by an Australian Jewish writer, and he called Once.
Once.
Yeah, and every chapter starts with the word once.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and yeah, he adored that. He cried in that book. It's the first time he's ever cried in a book.
Wow.
Um,
What's do you know? You don't know the author. It's okay.
yeah, his name is Morris Gleitzman.
Okay, great. Australian books are wonderful to get because this is what you know. Somehow, books still, in general, there's more Canadian books on the bookshelves and American where I
Mm.
shop. The Iron Man by Ted Hughes is one that's kind of this ilk that I would throw
Oh
in there
yeah,
for your son if you don't have it already.
no, I don't have that one. Um, yeah, it's sort of hard now because we've moved from the US recently back to Australia, and all my 43 boxes of books are still in transit on the ocean somewhere, on their way here. Um, so I don't have the books to look at, to remember what.
You must feel kind of like you've left part of yourself crawling across the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, it's always weird to start again, and but I tell you, this series for kids that had a really big impact on my son. It's this series of, they're like graphic motivational quotes that have been, it's a series called Zen Pencils.
Hmm.
Do you,
Zen.
yeah, Zen, yeah, Zen pencils, and they're
Zen pencils.
just
No, don't know it.
have like little speeches. Whether it's by Nelson Mandela or Gandhi or or artists, and then they've been made into little comics. Um, my son kind of lived with that book for a year, and
Wow.
I feel like it really seeped into him. So I would really recommend those books. I've like bought them for heaps of people as gifts. They're just fantastic.
Are
I
you
think
doing any?
there are three of them. There's Zen Pencils, a sequel to that, and then another book which is just on the creative struggle. Um, yeah, I love those. Yeah, for kids and
And are
adults.
you doing anything consciously on screen time to encourage reading?
Um, well,
Like, do you let them watch TV?
oh yeah. I do let him watch TV. Um, I don't let him watch YouTube. That's a thing. Obviously, not from my childhood, but I well, actually, it's not true. There are historical channels that I let him watch on YouTube, but I know a lot of kids who are lost down this rabbit hole of YouTube, and I think it's yeah, there's a lot of shit in there, and also they get really used to watching things that last for like 4 to 7 minutes, and
Yeah,
I don't think that's a healthy thing. But
yeah,
I'm a lover of story, and there's a lot of so TV is another another place where narrative lives, and I'm fully on board with that. I have a iPad with a Kindle app, and I let him like read comics on Kindle because Kindle Unlimited has just access to like loads of comics.
hmm.
Um, and reading is reading, and like I remember when I was a kid, my parents encouraged me, reading Peanuts or whatever was Calvin and Hobbes was huge,
Mm-hmm.
for me
Mm.
and for my son. Um, and so, yeah, getting your child to become a reader, just like as I said again, like whatever allows them to know that sitting down with a book or a comic or anything with something and reading as pleasure, then if they do that, they'll have that their whole lives.
Yeah.
um, and I think that you have boys,
Yes.
so I think
Yes.
for boys, in the same way that like Twitter and online, like I feel like Twitter and a lot of on Facebook and reading articles, that takes away from adults reading time. I think that video games is the thing that takes away from, like, I don't think TV takes away from reading, but video games, the unlimited nature of them, um, that takes away from
Mm.
reading. So I think with boys, you have to be kind of careful there.
Yeah. 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 Uh, yeah. Well, we're trying our best. We have keeping books in every room. Well, we certainly close off the night with lots of books, and we are, trying to let them see us read. That's a
Yeah,
thing that's kind of a big one. But this is really helpful. And as we close off this conversation, Steve, discussing and unpacking and getting into your writing process and your own books through your three most formative books, I'd love to just close things off with a few fast money round questions if you have time for it.
sure.
Hardcover, paperback, audio, or e?
Paperback. I
Mm.
don't like hardcovers. I don't really like. I do have books on my e-reader, my kind of Kindle app, but that's a process of like from moving around so much. I bought my favorite books so many times in so many different countries. Yeah, I keep them digitally as well, but I prefer to read paperbacks.
Nice. Number two, when the 43 boxes arrive, how do you organize your books on your bookshelf?
I don't even have any books shelves, so they're going to be stacked up in on the floors in this new place for a while at least. I don't really organize them. I just yeah, it's just a mess. I just try to keep them in neat stacks.
Nice. Is there anything you would, or what's one thing you would change about the publishing or book industry?
Anything I would change about the publishing or book industry? Well, the publishing industry is in love with debuts. Like they
Hmm.
just, you know, to the extent that second and third, fourth novels, it's just they just are interested in the bright new thing. So yeah, I mean, if I could change that, I would um, encourage the industry that reviews and everything to just kind of stick with authors and not worry about whether it's an author's first.
Hmm. Why is that, by the way?
The shiny new thing. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, human nature. Yeah, I worked at Walmart for 10 years and there was a quote on the walls that said, "Newness is the lifeblood of retail."
Oh God, it's how depressing.
Because you feel the commercial. Yeah. Okay, what is your favorite bookstore, living or dead?
My favorite bookstore. Gosh. I mean, I really loved the Shakespeare and Co. bookstore in Paris when I lived there. That was really, really a great one. Um, my favorite ones, of course, are those kind of big cavernous ones. There was one called Gould's Bookstore in Sydney. I'm not even sure if it's still there, in which is in Glebe in Sydney, which is just was a complete mess. You just wander through the stacks. But my other favorite ones are kind of small ones that are just so incredibly well curated. Um, there was one on Avenue A in New York. God, I can't remember what it was called. Mast Books, I think. Um, there's a bookstore in Los Angeles called Alias Books in Atwater Village, which every novel it feels like they really made a conscious decision to not have anything other than a particular style of book, and everything's just very well curated. So yeah, I like that in a bookstore.
Thank you. And to close off this wonderful conversation, you've given us a lot to think about, to chew on, to reflect on. Is there, and a lot of people listening to this, just so you know, Three Books is by and for book lovers, writers, makers, sellers, and librarians. Is there one final hard fought piece of advice or piece of wisdom that you would leave as a final breadcrumb for all the other aspiring writers listening to this right now?
Yeah, I think, yeah, ignore your contemporaries and just never stop reading. Never stop reading. And I mean, we're in a bit of a we're in a tricky age where an addictive force has been pressed upon us, and we have to fight. The yeah, deep focus is the coin of the realm, I would say. And that is the thing that is being lost and chipped away at. And you have to fight to get your focus back. And so, yeah, put your technology away in another room and read.
Deep focus is the coin of the realm. If you are with us in between an hour and a half and 2 hours deep into this conversation, you have it. So keep it shiny and keep nurturing it. Thank you, Steve, so much for coming on Three Books. It's a real honor and pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It was really fun. Thanks.